Fantastic. Thank you ever so much. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that President Muhammadu Buhari very much wanted to be part of this very important dialogue, but had to travel out of the country at very short notice. And as you say, he's asked me to deliver his statement. So his statement is this. Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, President, African Development Bank, our own Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, the Chair of the Board, Global Center for Adaptation, Ban Ki-moon, the CEO, Global Center for Adaptation, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by thanking the African Development Bank, the Global Center for Adaptation, and the United Nations for organizing this very important meeting. The theme of this meeting, Leaders' Dialogue on the Africa COVID Climate Emergency, is extremely apt at this time, taking into account the devastating combined effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate change on our continent. Nigeria is very pleased to note the initiatives advanced by the African Development Bank and the Global Center for Adaptation. These strategies ensure that Africa's recovery from the combined effects of COVID-19 and climate change are holistic, resilient, harmonious, and reflective of the peculiarities and priorities of our continent. International support in this regard is essential to guarantee that no part of the world is left behind in the global recovery effort. We're therefore delighted to be part of this frank and constructive dialogue on cooperation amongst African leaders. Excellencies, our gathering today is a testimony to our collective commitment to move the African continent out of the doldrums of COVID-19 and climate change and set her on the path of total recovery. We recall that before the pandemic, the world had been reeling under the devastating effects of climate change. Some of these effects include global warming, floods, droughts, storms, rising sea levels, and melting glaciers that directly harm animals and destroy natural habitats, while also wreaking havoc on people's lives and livelihoods. In addition, climate change has contributed to rising insurgency and armed conflict on the continent, with resultant displacement of persons and livelihoods. The situation of the Lake Chad Basin is an example of the risks and effects associated with climate change. So Nigeria welcomes wholeheartedly the launch of the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program as an initiative to address regional adaptation gaps and support the transition of countries to low-carbon development pathways. Being one of the most vulnerable nations, Nigeria will not hesitate to leverage on this program to forestall the exacerbating impact of climate change. Your Excellencies, nowhere are the adverse impacts of climate change felt more than in Africa, where millions of smallholder farmers rely upon their land for their lives and livelihoods. Multiple systemic shocks are now threatening African communities at the same time. We have a health crisis, a food crisis, security crisis, an economic crisis, and all these compounded by the climate crisis. The combination of COVID-19 and climate impacts have severely devastated our economies. Countries around the world have collectively allocated over $20 trillion in COVID stimulus packages, thereby reducing the resources available to combat climate change. Climate change cannot wait while we address COVID-19. They must be addressed together. Nigeria's development is already highly undermined by climate change impacts, with, for example, the big flood of 2012 causing damage of as much as 1.4% of Nigeria's real GDP growth in that year. Together with droughts, changing rainfall patterns, and sea level rising, Nigeria's nationally determined contribution highlights these as main climate risks, with agricultural yields expected to decline between 10 and 25% by 2080 on average, and in the north by up to 50%, food security is therefore likely to be further undermined while import would increase. With Lake Chad shrinking, the less than 40% of the population that has direct access to potable water is expected to further decrease. A rising sea level of 1 meter by 2100 could lead to a loss of 75% of Nigeria's delta area. It's clear, therefore, that strong adaptation action must be implemented to build resilience. We have therefore deployed significant financial resources to scale up adaptation efforts. We have mainstreamed adaptation into our national development strategy. We have aligned this strategy with future expected impacts of climate change. We commend the African Development Bank for providing some of these resources and for its commitment to allocate $25 billion to climate change between 2020 and 2025. This, however, is obviously still not enough compared to the needs on the continent. Current estimates of the cost of climate change to Africa are between $7 to $15 billion per year, and this could rise to $40 billion per year by 2040. Certainly, we welcome and commend the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, jointly developed and implemented by the Global Center on Adaptation and the African Development Bank to scale up and accelerate adaptation in Africa. It also seeks to mobilize an additional $12.5 billion to finance adaptation on the continent. Strengthening Africa's resilience to climate change will also strengthen its resilience to COVID-19 and other pandemics that may emerge in the future. So we're pleased to see that Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program has already identified projects that will be of benefit to Nigeria and other African countries. Some of these are the Informal Artisans Upgrade and Medium, Small and Micro Enterprises Clustering Program, which aims to support artisan workers to strengthen their businesses and scale up their efforts while responding to climate threats in order to drive resilient economic development. And there's the Africa Disaster Risk Financing Program, which will support Nigeria's producers' resilience and response to climate shocks by improving disaster risk management and adaptation to climate change. And if this receives sufficient resources, the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program should aim to mobilize and deploy at least $100 million in disaster risk financing through Africa Disaster Risk Financing Program integrated into at least 15 country operations across 3 regions. So with sufficient resources, the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program should be able to support Nigeria's adaptation priority to strengthen its coastal resilience and delta management by supporting national level infrastructure assessment and planning and the development of bankable projects in implementing strategies for improved resource management, support sector-specific strategies, policies, programs and measures in such areas as agriculture, freshwater resources, coastal and water resources and fisheries, forest biodiversity, health and sanitation, human settlements and housing, energy, transportation and communications, industry and commerce, disaster, migration and security, livelihoods, vulnerable groups, education, etc. So it really can have an impact right across the board. So we call on development partners to urgently allocate more resources to adaptation in Africa in general and to the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program in particular, to enable them to address Africa's huge vulnerability to the adverse impact of climate change and other emerging pandemics. The COVID-19 stimulus packages should not, and I repeat, should not deprive African countries of the resources needed for climate change. Climate change should be mainstreamed into stimulus packages to African countries in order to build forward better. Thank you very much indeed for your kind attention.